Translate it. Or admit you don't belong in this room. The sentence didn't just land, it cut clean through the low hum of conversation like a blade through silk. Glasses paused mid-air. A fork hovered inches above a plate. Somewhere in the background, a piano note lingered too long, like even the music was waiting. Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his chair, one arm draped casually over polished mahogany, the faintest smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Power, real power, never shouted. It simply assumed it would be obeyed. Across the table, a few investors exchanged glances, subtle but sharp, the kind that said something was about to happen, and they didn't want to miss it. Phones shifted slightly, angled just enough to capture without being obvious. This wasn't just dinner anymore. It was theater. And someone had just been cast as the punchline. Naomi Brooks stood a few feet away, a linen cloth folded neatly over her wrist, a bottle of sparkling water balanced effortlessly in her other hand. She had been invisible all night, moving between tables like a quiet rhythm no one noticed unless it stopped. 23 years old, working double shifts, carrying more weight in her silence than most people carried in their words. She had learned early that in rooms like this, you weren't ignored by accident. You were ignored by design. And sometimes, that invisibility was protection. But not tonight. Tonight, someone had decided to look directly at her. Ethan slid a document across the table with 2 fingers, slow, deliberate, like he was setting a trap he was certain would snap shut. The pages were dense, filled with tight columns of foreign text, the kind of legal language that turned even confident executives cautious. He tapped it once, the sound soft but commanding. "Go ahead," he said, almost amused. "Show us how smart you are." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the table, not loud enough to be called out, but clear enough to sting. Naomi didn't move right away. Her fingers tightened slightly around the cloth, just for a second, just enough for anyone paying attention to notice. Then it was gone. Her expression stayed calm, unreadable, like still water that hid its depth. She stepped forward, placing the water bottle gently on the table without a sound, her movements precise, controlled. The document sat there between them now, no longer just paper, but a line drawn in plain sight. She glanced down, her eyes scanning the first page. Not rushing. Not hesitating. Just looking. And in that brief, quiet moment, something shifted, too subtle for most to catch, but real all the same. Because what Ethan Caldwell didn't know, what no one in that room could possibly see, was that this wasn't just a translation. It was a test. Just not the one he thought he was giving. Naomi reached for the document, her fingers steady as they brushed the edge of the page, and for the first time all night, the room didn't feel like it belonged to the man at the head of the table. It felt like it was holding its breath, waiting to see who it would belong to next. Naomi did not look up when the quiet laughter faded into something thinner, more uncertain, like a sound that had lost its confidence halfway through existing. Her eyes moved line by line, steady, deliberate, absorbing the structure, the rhythm, the intent behind the words rather than just the words themselves. The paper was not casual. It was precise, layered, written to impress and conceal at the same time. Numbers sat beside clauses that bent meaning without ever breaking it. To most people in the room, it would have looked like complexity. To her, it looked like intention. Ethan watched her closely now, no longer leaning back as far, his fingers tapping once against the table before going still again. He expected hesitation. He expected the slight panic people got when they realized they had been pushed too far into something they could not handle. That moment when confidence cracked. But it did not come. Naomi turned the page with a soft flick of her fingers, the sound barely audible, yet somehow louder than the earlier laughter. One of the investors shifted in his seat. Another leaned forward, elbows near the edge of the table, eyes narrowing with curiosity instead of amusement. The air changed. Not dramatically. Just enough to feel different. Naomi finally spoke, her voice calm, even, carrying just far enough to reach everyone without forcing itself into the space. She began with a sentence in fluent Japanese, the cadence smooth, natural, not rehearsed but lived in, like a language that had been part of her long before this moment. A few heads turned immediately. Someone at the far end of the table stopped mid-sip, lowering their glass slowly. Ethan's expression did not collapse, but it tightened, just slightly, the kind of adjustment a person makes when something does not match their expectation. Naomi continued, translating not word for word, but meaning for meaning, adjusting phrases, clarifying intent, reshaping the legal structure into something that sounded clearer in English than it had on the page. She paused once, just long enough to let a specific clause settle into the room. Then she spoke again, softer this time, but sharper. She pointed to a line halfway down the page, her finger hovering above the ink without touching it, as if even the paper did not need to be disturbed to reveal what it was hiding. This section, she said, her tone unchanged, does not say what it looks like it says. The room did not react immediately. It waited. She translated the clause again, slower, breaking it apart, exposing the conditional phrasing, the subtle shift in liability that redirected responsibility away from one party and onto another without ever stating it directly. One of the investors straightened in his chair. Another reached for his copy of the document, flipping pages with a quiet urgency. Ethan leaned forward now, no longer relaxed, his eyes moving between Naomi and the paper in front of him. Naomi did not rush. She explained the implication, how a single interpretation could change the outcome of the entire agreement, how a signature placed too quickly could commit to something far beyond what had been discussed. No accusation. No performance. Just clarity. The kind that did not ask for attention, but took it anyway. Silence followed, not the polite kind from earlier, but something heavier, more grounded, as if the room had shifted its weight and was no longer balanced the same way. Naomi lowered her hand, the document still open between them, and for the first time that night, the power at the table did not feel centered where it had been before. The silence did not break all at once, it unraveled slowly, like a thread being pulled from the center of something carefully woven, and the first sound to return was not a voice but the faint rustle of paper as one of the investors flipped back to the clause Naomi had just exposed, his movements no longer casual but precise, almost cautious, as if the document itself had changed under his hands. Ethan Caldwell did not speak immediately, and that alone shifted more than any reaction could have, because men like him filled silence by instinct, controlled it, shaped it, used it as a tool, but now the silence was not his to command. His eyes moved across the page again, sharper this time, tracing the language he had already reviewed hours earlier, the same lines he had trusted, the same structure he had approved, and yet now it read differently, not because the words had changed, but because the lens had. Naomi stood still, her posture unchanged, not defensive, not triumphant, simply present, as if she had not just redirected the entire trajectory of a multi-million-dollar agreement with a few measured sentences. One of the men at the table cleared his throat softly, not to speak but to release the pressure building in his chest, while another leaned back, exhaling slowly, his earlier amusement now replaced with something closer to respect, though he would not name it out loud. Ethan finally reached for the document, pulling it closer, his fingers pressing lightly against the margin where Naomi had pointed, and for a brief moment, the confidence that had defined him all evening flickered, not gone, but forced to adjust. "Explain that again," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of the earlier edge, not a command this time, but something closer to a request he was not used to making. Naomi did not rush to fill the space. She let the moment settle, let the weight of his words exist before answering, and when she spoke, it was with the same calm clarity, breaking the clause into its parts, showing how the phrasing shifted liability, how the conditional language created a path that could be interpreted against his interests if executed without revision. She did not dramatize it. She did not soften it. She simply revealed it. Around the table, phones that had once been angled for entertainment were now being lowered, their purpose quietly dissolving as the narrative they expected slipped out of reach. This was no longer about catching a mistake. It was about witnessing a correction. Ethan leaned back slightly, but not in comfort, more in recalibration, his gaze lifting from the paper to Naomi. Studying her in a way he had not before, not as background, not as staff, but as a variable he had failed to account for. The room followed his lead without realizing it, eyes shifting, perspectives adjusting, the hierarchy that had been so clear at the beginning of the night now blurred at the edges. Naomi closed the document gently, aligning the pages with a small, precise motion, then placed it back on the table between them, not pushing it toward him, not pulling it away, leaving it exactly where it needed to be. "If this is signed as it is," she said, her voice steady, "the interpretation favors them, not you." No emphasis. No warning tone. Just fact. And in that moment, the weight of the evening settled fully into place, because the test that had been meant to expose her had done something else entirely. It had revealed a flaw in the one who believed he was asking the questions, and for the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell was not the one in control of the outcome. No one reached for their drink this time, not even out of habit, because the room had crossed a line it could not easily return from, and everyone felt it in the quiet tension that now replaced the earlier ease. Ethan kept his eyes on the document for a moment longer, then slowly closed it, his fingers resting flat against the cover as if grounding himself in something solid. When he finally looked up, it was not with the dismissive glance he had given Naomi before, but with a measured focus, the kind reserved for people he considered worth his time. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone not paying close attention, but it was there. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, his voice steady, stripped to performance, carrying just enough curiosity to reveal that this was no longer a game to him. Naomi did not answer immediately. She folded the linen cloth once, then again, aligning the edges with quiet precision, a small action that gave her just enough space to choose her words without rushing. "I read," she said simply, her tone even, not defensive, not proud, just factual. A few eyebrows lifted around the table, not because of what she said, but because of what she did not say. She did not offer a story. She did not justify her presence. She did not explain how someone in her position could know what she knew. She just let the answer exist, incomplete in a way that forced people to fill in the gaps themselves. Ethan studied her for another second, then leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose in a controlled breath that carried more weight than any reaction he could have spoken. Across the table, one of the investors finally broke the silence, tapping his pen lightly against his own copy of the agreement. "She is right," he said, not loudly, but clearly enough that it landed where it needed to. Another voice followed, then another, each one quieter than the last, but all pointing in the same direction. The consensus formed without discussion, a shift in alignment that did not require debate because the logic was already there, laid out in plain sight. Ethan nodded once, a small, decisive motion, then reopened the document, flipping back to the clause Naomi had highlighted. This time, he read it not as the author of the deal, but as someone who had just been shown what he had missed. The difference was immediate. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. "We revise this," he said, more to himself than to anyone else, though the room heard it all the same. The authority in his voice had returned, but it was different now, grounded in correction rather than assumption. Naomi remained where she was, neither stepping back into invisibility nor moving forward into the center, holding her place with quiet balance. She did not interrupt. She did not insert herself further. She had said what needed to be said. Ethan closed the document again, this time with intention, then shifted his attention fully to her. The room followed, drawn by the gravity of the moment, waiting for something that none of them could quite predict. "Stay," he said, the single word carrying more weight than the entire conversation that had come before it. It was not a command in the way it had been earlier. It was something else, something closer to acknowledgement. Naomi met his gaze for a brief moment, just long enough to confirm that she understood exactly what he meant, then gave a small nod, not submissive, not eager, simply aware. And in that exchange, quiet and controlled, the balance of the room settled into its new shape, one where power had not disappeared, but had been forced to recognize something it could not buy, could not assume, and could no longer ignore. The word lingered in the air long after it was spoken, not because it was loud, but because of what it replaced. Earlier, Ethan Caldwell had controlled the room with ease, shaping the conversation, setting the tone, deciding who mattered and who did not. Now, with a single quiet instruction, he had done something far more revealing. He had made space. Naomi did not move immediately. She stood where she was, the linen cloth resting lightly in her hands, her posture composed, her presence no longer something that blended into the background. Around the table, the energy shifted again, not sharply this time, but steadily, like a tide that had already turned and was no longer asking permission to continue. One of the investors leaned toward Ethan, lowering his voice, though not enough to keep it from carrying. If that clause had gone through as written, the exposure could have been significant, he said, choosing his words carefully, but the meaning was clear. Not a minor oversight. Not a harmless detail. A real risk. Ethan gave a small nod, his gaze still fixed on Naomi for a fraction of a second longer before returning to the document. It will not go through like that, he replied, calm, controlled, but now anchored in correction rather than assumption. He flipped the pages again, slower this time, his attention sharper, his confidence recalibrated, not diminished but refined. Across the table, the earlier sense of entertainment had completely dissolved. No one was smiling now. No one was waiting for a mistake. They were watching something else entirely. Recognition. Naomi stepped slightly to the side, not retreating, not advancing, simply adjusting her position as if she understood the new shape of the room better than anyone else in it. She did not insert herself into the conversation that followed, even as the discussion turned directly to the revision she had pointed out. She listened. Observed. The same way she had all night. But now, the difference was undeniable. When someone spoke, their eyes flickered toward her, just for a second, as if measuring their own understanding against hers. Ethan closed the document once more, this time with a decisive finality, then rested his hands on the table, fingers interlaced, his posture no longer casual but fully engaged. We adjust the language, he said, looking around the table, reclaiming his role, but doing it differently now. We remove the ambiguity. We make the liability explicit. There was agreement, immediate and quiet, the kind that came from clarity rather than persuasion. Naomi watched without expression, but there was a subtle shift in her gaze, not pride, not satisfaction, just awareness. She had seen this before. Different room. Different people. Same pattern. Power correcting itself when it was forced to see what it had overlooked. Ethan turned back to her once more, and this time, there was no trace of the earlier smirk, no edge of challenge, no attempt to reassert dominance through tone. You caught that in one read, he said, not a question, not quite a statement, something in between, something that acknowledged both the speed and the depth of what she had done. Naomi met his eyes again, steady, unshaken. It was not hidden, she said. It was just written for people who do not expect to be questioned. The word settled into the room with a weight that no one could ignore, because they were not just about the document. They were about everything that had happened before it. Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, the kind that carried more meaning than any apology could. Around them, the room resumed its movement, but not in the same way as before. Conversations restarted, glasses were lifted, notes were taken, but something fundamental had shifted beneath it all. The balance had not just changed for a moment. It had reset. And at the center of that change stood someone who had never needed to raise her voice to be heard. The conversation resumed, but it did not return to what it had been, because once a room has seen what it missed, it cannot pretend it was never there. Voices were lower now, more deliberate, each word chosen with a level of care that had not existed before, and even the smallest pauses carried meaning. Ethan adjusted the document again, marking a section with the tip of his pen, then another, his movements precise, efficient, but no longer automatic. He was thinking. Really thinking. And that alone was a shift no one at the table could ignore. Naomi remained just outside the immediate circle, close enough to hear, far enough to not intrude, her presence steady, almost anchored, as if she understood that this moment was no longer about proving anything. It was about what came after. One of the senior partners, a man who had barely spoken earlier, leaned forward slightly, his attention now fully engaged. If we restructure this clause, he said, glancing briefly toward Naomi before returning his gaze to Ethan, we protect our position without reopening the entire agreement. It was a suggestion, but it carried weight, the kind that only appeared when people started to recalibrate who they were listening to. Ethan nodded once, considering it, then looked back at the page. "Do it," he said, simple, direct, but this time grounded in collaboration rather than control. The table responded immediately, pens moving, notes being adjusted, the machinery of high-level decision-making shifting into motion again, but with a different rhythm, one that felt less like dominance and more like precision. Naomi watched quietly, her eyes moving across the table, taking in the subtle changes most people would miss, the way shoulders had relaxed just slightly, the way people now listened before speaking, the way no one dismissed anything too quickly. These were small things, almost invisible, but they were real. And they mattered. A server passed behind her, carrying a tray, moving carefully through the narrow space, and for a brief moment, Naomi stepped aside to let them pass, her movement fluid, instinctive, a reminder that despite everything, she was still expected to return to the role she had started the night in. But something about that expectation no longer fit the same way. Ethan finished marking the final adjustment, then set his pen down with a soft, controlled motion, his decision made. He looked up again, scanning the table, confirming alignment, then his gaze settled on Naomi once more. Not briefly this time. Fully. Directly. "You saw it faster than any of us," he said, his voice carrying across the table without effort. It was not loud, but it did not need to be. Every person in the room heard it. Naomi did not react immediately. She held his gaze, steady, balanced, neither shrinking from the attention nor stepping into it. "You were not looking for it," she replied, her tone calm, measured, not critical, just honest. A faint shift moved through the room again, not tension this time, but something closer to understanding, because her words did not just explain the oversight. They explained the mindset behind it. Ethan absorbed that, his expression unchanged on the surface, but something deeper adjusted, something that could not be undone once seen. He gave a small nod, slower this time, more deliberate, then leaned back slightly, not in dismissal, but in acceptance of a new reality that had formed right in front of him. Around them, the meeting moved forward, decisions being finalized, language being refined, but the center of gravity had already shifted. Naomi glanced down at the folded cloth in her hands for a brief moment, then back up at the table, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, as if she had always belonged in this space, even when no one had noticed. And now that they did, the room itself felt different, not because it had changed, but because the truth within it had finally been spoken out loud. By the time the final revisions were agreed upon, the room no longer felt like a stage for dominance but a space shaped by something quieter and far more difficult to control. The documents were aligned, the language sharpened, the risks addressed with a clarity that had not existed an hour earlier, and yet no one reached for celebration. There was no applause, no raised glasses, no casual remarks to break the weight of what had just unfolded. Instead, there was a kind of stillness that only comes when people realize they have witnessed something that cannot be undone. Ethan closed the folder with a deliberate motion, the soft sound echoing more than it should have in a room filled with glass and polished wood. He rested his hand on top of it for a moment, as if confirming that everything inside had finally settled into place, then he stood, not abruptly, not with the urgency of a man rushing to the next deal, but with intention. Chairs shifted slightly as others followed, some out of habit, others because they were no longer sure where they stood in relation to him. The hierarchy that once felt fixed now carried a subtle uncertainty, not chaotic, but changed. Naomi stepped back half a step as the movement around the table increased, her instinct guiding her to create space, to return to the rhythm she had always known, the one where she moved quietly between conversations that were never meant to include her. But this time, the movement did not continue past her. Ethan's voice cut through the low shuffle of chairs, not loud, but clear enough to stop the moment before it dissolved. Naomi. It was the first time he had used her name. Not a title, not a gesture, not a generic call for service, but her name, spoken with precision, as if it mattered to get it right. The room paused again, not out of tension this time, but attention. Naomi turned, meeting his gaze without hesitation, her expression steady, her posture unchanged, as if she had been expecting this moment without needing to prepare for it. Ethan took a step closer, closing the distance just enough to shift the dynamic from across the table to something more direct, more human. For a brief second, it looked like he might speak quickly, return to the efficiency that defined him, but he did not. He paused, choosing his words with the same care he had just applied to the contract. "You did not just translate that document," he said, his voice even, stripped of performance, carrying something quieter beneath it. "You changed the outcome." The word settled into the room with a different kind of weight, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but undeniable. Naomi did not respond right away. She let the statement exist, unchallenged, unexpanded, the way truth often does when it does not need to be defended. Around them, a few of the investors exchanged glances, subtle nods passing between them, not as approval, but recognition of something they had not anticipated walking into the room that night. Naomi finally spoke, her tone as calm as it had been from the beginning. "The outcome was already there," she said. "It just needed to be seen." There was no edge in her voice, no attempt to diminish or elevate what had happened, only clarity. Ethan held her gaze for a moment longer, absorbing that, then gave a slight nod, slower than before, as if acknowledging not just her words, but the shift they represented. In that moment, it became clear to everyone in the room that what had changed was not just a contract, not just a decision, but the way value itself had been measured, and for the first time that night, no one questioned where that value truly came from. The room did not return to noise, it settled into something more controlled, more aware, as if every movement now carried intention where before it had carried assumption. People gathered their notes, closed folders, adjusted jackets, but no one rushed to leave, not immediately, because leaving too quickly would have meant missing the weight of what had just happened, and no one in that room wanted to be the one who overlooked something twice in a single night. Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, his attention no longer divided between documents and decisions, but focused, steady, grounded in something quieter than authority. Naomi stood across from him, the folded linen still resting in her hands, a small detail that now felt almost symbolic, a reminder of where she had started the night and the space she now occupied without ever asking for it. One of the investors approached Ethan, speaking in a low voice about timelines, about next steps, about how quickly the revised agreement could be finalized, but even as the conversation moved forward, his eyes flickered once toward Naomi, a brief acknowledgement that did not need to be spoken out loud. Others followed in small ways, a nod here, a glance there, subtle shifts that, taken together, formed something larger than any single gesture. Recognition does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it builds quietly, one moment at a time, until it becomes impossible to ignore. Ethan listened, responded, made decisions with the same efficiency that had defined him before, but now there was a difference in how he held the room. It was not about control anymore. It was about awareness. When the last detail was confirmed and the final note was made, the meeting naturally reached its end, not with a clear signal, but with a shared understanding that there was nothing left to add. Chairs moved back into place, the soft scrape of wood against the floor blending with the low murmur of voices preparing to transition back into the outside world. Naomi turned slightly, her body already aligning with the path she knew she was expected to take, back toward the rhythm of service, back toward the quiet spaces between conversations. But before she could step away, Ethan spoke again, not to stop her, but to redirect the moment. "One last time. Walk with me," he said, his tone even, not demanding, not hesitant, simply clear. It was not a request that fit easily into the structure of the evening, and that was precisely why it carried weight. Naomi paused for a fraction of a second, then nodded once, acknowledging without overthinking, without hesitation, as if she understood that this was not about status or roles anymore. They moved together toward the edge of the private room, past the long table that had held the entire night's tension, past the soft glow of overhead lights reflecting off polished surfaces, toward a quieter corridor where the noise of the restaurant softened into a distant hum. The shift in space was immediate. No audience. No observers. Just distance from the moment that had changed everything. Ethan slowed his pace slightly, giving the silence room to exist between them, not rushing to fill it, not forcing conversation where it was not needed. Naomi walked beside him with the same calm presence she had carried all night, neither ahead nor behind, simply there. And in that quiet stretch between the room they had left and whatever came next, something unspoken settled into place, not an agreement, not a decision, but an understanding that what had happened was not temporary, not something that would fade once the night ended, but something that would carry forward in ways neither of them had fully defined yet. The corridor felt different from the room they had left behind, not quieter in sound, but quieter in expectation, as if the air itself no longer demanded anything from them. Soft lights lined the walls, casting a steady glow that erased the sharp edges of the night, and for a few steps, neither of them spoke. Ethan walked with a measured pace, his hands relaxed at his sides, no longer holding documents, no longer directing a room, just moving forward without the need to control what came next. Naomi matched that pace naturally, her steps light, balanced, the folded linen still resting in her hands, though now it felt less like part of her role and more like a reminder of where the evening had begun. When Ethan finally stopped, it was not abrupt. He turned slightly toward her, giving the moment space to settle before he spoke, the way someone does when they understand that words, once said, will carry weight beyond the moment they are spoken in. "You should not be working that floor," he said, his voice calm, not dismissive, not critical, but certain in a way that came from recognition rather than judgment. Naomi did not react immediately. She had heard variations of that sentence before, offered with different intentions, different assumptions, different outcomes. Some meant opportunity. Some meant dismissal. Some meant nothing at all. She met his gaze, steady as always, her expression unchanged. "I am working where I am needed," she replied, her tone even, not defensive, not apologetic, simply true. Ethan studied her for a moment, not searching for weakness, not testing, but trying to understand something he had not taken the time to see before. "That is not the same thing," he said, quieter now, as if the distinction mattered more to him than it had just minutes ago. Naomi tilted her head slightly, not in disagreement, but in acknowledgement of the difference he was pointing to, though she did not rush to fill the space with more explanation. Silence stretched between them again, but it was no longer empty. It was deliberate. Ethan exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that carried the shift of someone adjusting not just a decision, but a perspective. "You saw what we missed," he continued, his voice steady. "That is not luck. That is not chance. That is skill." The word settled differently than anything else he had said, because it did not elevate her beyond the room, it placed her within it, as an equal, not an exception. Naomi looked at him for a moment longer, then down briefly at the linen in her hands, her fingers adjusting the fold without thinking, a small, grounding motion. "Skill is only useful if someone is willing to listen," she said, her tone calm, but the meaning clear. Ethan nodded once, slower this time, the kind of nod that comes from understanding something that cannot be undone once seen. "I am listening now," he replied. There was no performance in it. No attempt to impress. Just a statement, simple and direct. For a moment, neither of them moved, the weight of the conversation settling into place, not heavy, not overwhelming, but real. Then Naomi gave a small nod of her own, not as agreement, not as acceptance, but as acknowledgement that the moment had reached its natural end. She stepped back half a step, the distance returning just enough to restore the balance between them, then turned, her posture steady,